Hello, podcast listening world. We are back with another episode of the Chiltern Learning Trust podcast in association with the Department for Education's RISE programme. I am still, as ever, Adam Kohlbeck. I am still the Director of Teacher Quality here at Chiltern Learning Trust. And I'm also having the privilege of being the host of this podcast series. If you are time poor but motivation rich, then this is absolutely the place for you, because over the next 20 to 25 minutes or so, I'm going to be chatting with our guest, Jen Wright, all about successful lesson starts. So if that's something that you are interested in and you want to improve across your school, you have come to the right place. Jen, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Very much looking forward to getting into something that I think is one of those areas of teaching and learning that's often brushed over, I think sometimes we can kind of assume that we know what it is and we've got a shared understanding of it and that it's probably okay and probably good enough. But there's an awful lot more to it than often meets the eye. So I'm looking forward to getting into all of the nuts and bolts of that. Before we do you just want to give us just a brief overview of who you are, what you do, what you've done previously, and anything else from your life story that you'd like to share?
Okay. So yeah, I teach at Challney High School for girls, and we're an 11 to 16 school for girls. And I teach Key Stage 3 and GCSE history. And I previously worked at Challney High School for boys as well. And I've been here about 8 years now. As assistant head teacher, my main responsibilities have been teaching and learning and CPD. I also look at student leadership and a few other things.
Fab. Okay, yeah. So that's quite a sort of a varied array of hats that you wear within school leadership as well, eh? And so from Challney boys to Challney girls, what's the biggest difference between teaching at an all girls school and an all boys school, other than the obvious?
Yeah, I get that's a question I sort of get asked quite a lot, really. And I think for me, one of the things that I did learn quite early on in my career when teaching at the boys' school was about the pace of learning that was required. So if actually, I think that's probably where I became particularly aware of the importance of lesson starts, because making sure that you get that kind of climate for learning right, and you set that tone for learning at the beginning of the lesson. Is really, really crucial. But also the community that I teach, although the school has changed, the community is the same. So it is actually the sisters and the cousins of the boys that I previously taught. And it is often some of the same parents as well, which is really, really lovely to get to know some of those families over a long period of time now. And I think, first of all, it's important to talk about the context of the school. So we do have a high proportion of disadvantaged students, a high pupil premium. And also some of that kind of can be hidden, that people don't always necessarily ask for support and ask for help as well. So I think thinking about that context is really important for in terms of maximising learning and kind of opportunities. I think back when we had COVID, we became quite aware that it wasn't necessarily a situation where students didn't have a device at home, for example, but sometimes there was quite a lot of sharing of devices. And so it's thinking about making sure that we do get everything right in our lessons, because we don't want to be relying on students necessarily being able to do lots and lots of catching up at home. And the historic context of this school, particularly, that this school really has transformed in terms of its performance, in terms of outcomes at Key Stage 4, and in terms of our Ofsteds as well, going from an RI school to having two outstanding Ofsteds. And I guess really that's been a wealth of strategies over sort of the last 7 to 8 years, really. And I'm really lucky to work as part of a team where I've worked with two outstanding head teachers as well, in order to really think about everything being quite connected. And I think when I was thinking about this question for this podcast, I think one of the things that I really thought about was that for me, I mean, people always ask, you don't know about are you into, are you curriculum or are you pastoral? And you kind of get that quite a lot, especially when you go for a leadership position. And I think for me, those things have always been so closely connected. And I think lesson starts are perfect really for talking about that, because it's also about that kind of conversation that you have when you're meeting and greeting a student at the threshold of your classroom. It's about that kind of being curious. So being curious about how are they, like looking for any kind of signs of like distraction potentially, or it might be that they are anxious or something like that. It might be that they're not actually very prepared for the lesson. And I think it's that pastoral side that's really important, to then making sure that the teaching and learning is successful. In terms of going back to disadvantage, as well, I guess in a similar way to SEND, what you do for one student is good for kind of for all. So if you're needing to, for example, hand out equipment or provide additional resources, some of those students may not require those things, but actually, there's no harm in doing those things, because obviously they benefit everyone. And sometimes you want to do things discreetly, because you want to support certain students in your class. But actually providing things to everyone then makes people feel like they're not being singled out for kind of extra attention. So I guess it's about being sort of equitable as well. One of the things we've really focused on in terms of starts of lessons has been something sort of, I'd say, a whole leadership team and has worked on over the years, is looking at the first five and last five of lessons, and I think that first kind of 5 minutes of where we meeting greeting at the door. So as a school we have a culture of that, so we do meet students as they come in, we sort of settle them down. And I guess that's that moment where you might notice, you sort of see them coming, that there might be some issues that they've had that day. And I think it's making sure that you have those do now activities, so you have something ready to kind of go. It could be that you've got something up on the board when they come in. We're very lucky here that we've got like BenQ boards, so we've got some really good technology. And so it might be that you've got something up that they can do straight away when they come in. It might be some retrieval practice. And we've got an expectation here that we do have a do now for every lesson. Obviously people use their professional judgment, and that what that looks like could be very different. So it could be some retrieval, or it could actually be that they're doing some we call fix-its, where they're fixing some previous work. It could be a little piece of reading that we're going to work on, because we've got a big focus at the moment on reading.
And that's you've covered so much there in such a short space of time, which is great. And I think you've already started to get to this the crux of like why lesson starts are so important, right? If they weren't so important, it probably wouldn't be so much to them. But if you were to kind of distill it down to like one core thing, like why is it that lesson starts are worth as much thought as what you have clearly put into them at Challney Girls?
I guess because it is that that sort of sets the tone for the whole lesson, doesn't it? So I think if you get that right, to be honest, I think it's worth putting the planning in for an engaging starter activity, something that's accessible, the right level of sort of stretch for students. Or maybe just something interesting as well, for them to do as well, which again just going to hook them into that learning of the lesson. And I think, as I say, it's that combination of being there when they arrive, and greeting them, and that doesn't have to be done in a really sort of theatrical way, where you're kind of high-fiving everyone. I'm not saying that, but it's just saying hello, getting people in and getting people started. I think if you set that culture, then that kind of stands you in good stead really for the rest of the lesson, because I think the students see that you're enthusiastic for learning, you want them to be there. And I say that's that overlap, isn't it, between the teaching and learning and the pastoral.
That's lovely, actually. That idea that actually they're so important because of the overlap of the teaching and learning and pastoral. And actually, like you could argue, I think that no other part of a lesson has quite that same kind of overlap between those two areas, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that is, say, key for setting the tone. And I guess in a similar way, maybe like the ends of lessons as well, where,
Yeah.
you're kind of dismissing people in an orderly way, because it's also thinking about the next teacher. How are they receiving the students that you're sending out into the corridor? But also, I guess there is where you might do that final check for learning as well, mightn't you? Checking for understanding, those kind of like last plenaries, and maybe like a little bit of targeted questioning that you might do, or an exit ticket or something. And I guess, again, that's that kind of combination.
Mm.
I think for me, some of the most powerful CPD that I had was actually when I was at my previous school, which was with Paul Dix. And that was around, when the adults change, everything changes, and around like positive reinforcement. And I think at the beginning of lessons, there could be that temptation to have some kind of negative conversations with certain students, okay, well, why are you not on task? Why have you not started? And I think that CPD was really powerful for me, and I know for other colleagues at the time, because it was about, instead of having those kinds of conversations at the beginning of lessons, why have you not got your equipment? Instead, it's actually just sometimes just handing out the equipment, because you don't necessarily know what that student's been through already that day. And for them to get to that point where they're sat down in your classroom, it could actually be that they've overcome several personal challenges to be there. So I think sometimes, letting go of your ego as well, and kind of realizing that them not starting or them not having the equipment is not necessarily actually anything about you. It doesn't reflect on their interest necessarily in the subject. Sometimes it's just a barrier that needs to be overcome. So I think handing out equipment, and then also we're going back to that CPD. I remember, for me, that's really always stuck with me really throughout my career, is that saying things like, I can see you're about to start, or you're brilliant, you're just picking your pen up, thank you, and rather than saying, oh, you're the only one who hasn't started. And it's such a small thing, but I think it does make a big difference. And that's, again, where you can get that right, because if you get that right at the start, you're likely to build that relationship with those students. They're likely to work harder, I think, because they want to be there, and because you're actually focusing on the bigger picture, which of course is obviously trying to get them to access the work, and engage with the learning.
Yeah, and it's a powerful lever, then, isn't it? That's what we're getting at here. Like the lesson starts is such a powerful lever, not just for that lesson, so setting the tone for the lesson to come, but also like that broader relationships piece between you and the students, but also that broader cultural piece across the whole school as well. And I really like what you were saying there about having that real attention to detail on like the minutiae of the words that you actually use. I often
Yes.
think, like, particularly at the start of lessons where you're narrating what's happening, because I think that's something that lots of teachers do. Just having that shift from please to thank you as well. If you are giving an instruction, rather than pick your pen up, please, and on with the work, please. Even if you just shift that to pen in hand, thank you. There's an expectancy there, and like there's a
Yes.
trust that you're going to do it if you
Yeah,
use thank you.
definitely.
Whereas please is kind of can sometimes sound a little bit hopeful. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
just being deliberate around like the minutiae of what on the face of it can seem like quite a straightforward thing. A lesson start, you just
yeah,
follow the process that's there. But there's so much that goes into it that makes it
yeah.
work. And that's why it's so important, right?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think it's kind of linked to that. It's that modelling, isn't it, that you're doing as a teacher, and a lot of that modelling again happens often at the beginning of the lesson. It's often when teachers are then moving on to doing that sort of teacher's explanation, and I guess you're modelling not only the teaching and learning, but like you say, the language that you use, the manners that you have,
Yeah.
and I think that again is where there's that overlap, with the pastoral and the teaching and learning, because you're juggling both of those things, aren't you? And you're kind of hopefully helping them with both of those kind of areas of their time at school.
Mm.
Um, and I think as well, it's, I say, like going back to that point about kind of like professional judgment. And obviously, I think sometimes when you have these conversations around what things you should make a kind of draw attention to and what things you shouldn't, I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding there that it's like, oh, okay, you're just going to let things slide. It's not that, but it's about sometimes discreetly talking to students, or speaking to them, having a quiet moment at a different point in the lesson rather than always at the beginning of the lesson. Because if you want ultimately, if you think your main goal is that you want them to do well in your subject, then sometimes if you have a negative conversation with them as they're coming in, or they maybe feel a little bit humiliated in front of their peers or something like that, then, or actually maybe they feel that they've got an audience for some of that behavior and they might actually quite enjoy that, then those things, I think you then lose them, and it's quite difficult then for them to actually, they're not going to then engage and they're not going to make progress anyway. But it's not that you let everything slide. It's not that you never speak to them about uniform, or you never speak to them about the fact that they've not got their equipment, but it's just about finding the right moment to do that. And I don't necessarily think that the beginning of a lesson is always the best time for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you really make that point there, that there is so much that goes into all of this, that it isn't just a case of like, this is our lesson start routine. It's about getting them in and getting them started. It is that on the face of it, but there's also so much else that goes on under the surface, and so many other kind of considerations that are ultimately just interacting all of the time with something that is, as I say, seemingly so straightforward and so simple. It's also really useful, I think, to hear your thinking on it, because particularly I think for teachers or even leaders who are new into their roles, or leaders that are trying to induct new staff into certain routines, for a new member of staff to come and watch a lesson start routine, they're going to see the surface level stuff. But actually, to what extent are they going to be noticing the fact that, oh, Jen let that student go? You know, they let that certain thing that student did go. Are they going to notice that? Well, no, they're not, because they don't understand the relationship that you've got with that student or the context of that student. Are they going to notice that shift from please to thank you, for example? You're not. If you just send staff to go and watch someone who is good at lesson starts, the likelihood of them picking up what you want them to pick up from that is really limited. You have to really invest the time in making sure that everybody in your school properly and fully understands the entire rationale around why you do things the way you do with these lesson starts. So if I was to say to you, okay, you've given us loads and loads and loads of stuff there, which is really, really useful and very interesting. But if I'm a leader in a school and I go, yeah, lesson starts is something that I want to improve across my school, what can I do next week to improve that? Or even if I'm a teacher who just wants to improve the lesson starts in my lessons, what's something I can do next week? What should my focus be over the course of like the next term and on a slightly more systemic level? And then what could I focus on doing over the next year that would really sustainably improve lesson starts in my school?
I think, if it's thinking about next week, I think that's the first thing you could sort of do really, is, if you're not kind of already, is sort of pre-planning and pre-organizing certain things. So, you can have book monitors, for example, so that you're not handing things out, that you instead could be kind of meeting and greeting, or just scanning the room, checking that people are okay, those sorts of things. So I think that's the first thing you can do, that meeting and greeting. And you can start thinking ahead about what lessons you've got, what groups you've got, and it can be really difficult for staff as well. I think, if you're moving from room to room, so I guess it's looking at your timetable. And actually, often as SLT, we move around quite a bit in different classrooms. So for me, it isn't always that I can have something logged on ready, because I might be going into a room and logging on. So it might be actually that I sometimes want to have something printed that I can hand out to students as they come in, or I might just have a question that I very quickly have written on a board if I'm kind of literally running from one room to another. So I guess it's thinking about your timetable and what works for you, because what works for one teacher might not actually be practical for you. But I think that definitely can happen. I think if it's longer term, I think over a term is actually making sure that there is that expectation. So where we have our teaching and learning framework here, we have sort of some principles that we have asked that we want staff to include in their lessons. So like one of them will be scaffolding, for example. One of them will be looking at questioning, but we don't prescribe when in the lesson those things happen. But we do sort of have an expectation as a school that there is a do now activity for every lesson. And as I say, we don't say it has to be retrieval. We say it could be any number of things. So I guess as well, if you wanted to improve them across the school, you could perhaps find where your best practices in certain departments and share that, and kind of say to staff, right, okay, we're going to have a focus on particularly these first 10 minutes of lessons, and sort of like maybe sort of give 3 things that you want staff to be doing. I'd also say I'm really privileged to work in a department where we have a fantastic head of history, and the fantastic team, where a lot of resources have been prepared as well, and we've worked on those over years, and the head of department has done a brilliant job at doing that. And I think if you're thinking longer term, again, freeing up staff so that they're not having to spend lots of time planning resources, and reinventing the wheel, because thinking about staff workload as well, isn't it? Where actually, if you're sharing resources and you've pre-made things, so if you've got new staff coming in, you can actually say to those ECTs, for example, here are the resources, tweak them, make them work for you, but you're not starting from scratch, and instead think about and focusing more on the how rather than the what you're teaching, but how are you going to do that do now activity, and how are you going to build those relationships with those students as they're coming in. Because I think often people are spending so much time making those resources that they kind of get lost in that they don't maybe have the time to then also have the capacity to then think about the smaller things that are going on.
That's great. So we've got this idea, right? Like, get ahead of your timetable. So if you know that, you're going to be going from this room to this room to this room, either make sure that you've got in your head a question that you're going to quickly write up when you get into that room, or have do now activities printed that you can hand out rather than taking the time to log on. And that's really important because it enables you to then look at probably that next layer, which is maybe your kind of termly focus, which is around, what am I actually doing during that do now period of time? Like, am I scanning the room and checking? Am I making sure that I'm greeting every student as they come in? You can really zoom in on the how, rather than just the what of the do now, if you've got ahead of all of those potential barriers and you've got that routine nicely set up. And then, like, more longer term than that, thinking, I guess, for leaders as well, about the consistency of the approach across the school. I think that particularly in a secondary setting where students can have, up to 11 different teachers across a week, I think having a really consistent approach to how lessons start has, although we might sometimes come up against that pushback of, but what about individual teacher autonomy? I think what trumps that is student experience. And if students have got that really predictable start to every lesson, it's going to end up being better for them. And it also means, again, that teachers have to do far less of the kind of operational explaining to students and reminding students how things work. And people can really then zoom in and focus on the how of how they're going to manage every individual interaction that they have. And that's where you get more of the teacher autonomy coming through. So I guess that longer term piece around looking at how consistent the approach is across the whole school, would that be fair?
Yeah, no, exactly that. I think it's like you say, it's working on that consistency, and it's maybe giving staff a framework. So by saying, okay, we do want everyone to be doing these certain things at the beginning of lessons. We do want everyone to have a do now, so that the students are coming in and they are maximising that learning time. Because as we sort of talked about earlier, or sort of alluded to, that we know that with a lot of our students, we can't rely on the expectation that they'll kind of catch things up at home. So we need to make sure we're maximising that learning time, because otherwise, sometimes at the beginning of lessons, that learning time can be lost, because actually people are taking so long to just kind of get set up. The students are taking so long to get ready for learning. So I think having clear routines, it sets your tone as a professional to the students as well, that they sort of see that they know what the diet is in your lesson, they know what they're coming to. And as you say, if you can get that across the school where there isn't a huge variation, that they know they're coming to a classroom where someone is going to talk to them calmly, assertively but calmly, and that also routines are going to be in place, equipment is going to be there ready, there are resources. I think if they know, as you say, that they're going from that for period 1 and they're going to period 2 and it's the same, that's going to kind of help them to focus as well calmly on their learning.
Fantastic stuff and super insightful. Who would have thought that we could have got an entire podcast out of just lesson starts? But you've managed it, Jen. That's been that's been brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us and for the time you've given to talk us through that. I'm sure that everybody listening will have taken an enormous amount from that. And if you did, then please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, please do spread the word to make sure that this podcast series gets out there as widely as possible and can impact as many people as it possibly can. Do also please join us on the next episode, which will come out the same time next week, when we'll be getting into a different area of school improvement in the same granular detail that Jen's taken us into around lesson starts today. Jen, thanks again for your time, and have a lovely rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.